Imagine a frozen morning in northern Ontario. The year is 1932. A woman stands alone on the steps of a mission house in a Cree village so remote that mail arrives only twice a year. She has been awake since 3 in the morning, not because she chose to be, but because something woke her. A heaviness she could not name, pressing down on her chest like a hand. Every denomination that once supported her has quietly withdrawn its funding. The mission board back in Toronto has sent a letter suggesting she return home and rest. Her husband has been dead for 4 years. She is 41 years old, and she is coughing blood. She does not go inside. She opens the door of the meeting room instead. That morning, in a wooden building with a leaking roof and a broken stove, 37 people come in from the cold. A man who has not spoken in 2 years begins to weep and then to speak. A woman with a spine so curved she had not stood upright in a decade stands up, slowly, without anyone touching her. The woman who opened the door does not consider herself a healer. She considers herself a failure. Her name is Winifred Buxton. And she was not a remarkable woman. She was a surrendered one. She was born in Barrie, Ontario, in 1891, the third of 5 children, into a Methodist household that was earnest, without being fervent. Her father worked the post office. Her mother kept a clean house and a cautious faith, the kind that believes in God the way one believes in a responsible government, sincerely, from a distance, without expecting much direct involvement. Winifred grew up singing hymns she understood perfectly and feeling nothing. She could tell you, by the age of 12, every doctrinal distinction between the Methodists and the Presbyterians on the next street over. She could not tell you whether any of it had ever actually touched her. She was bright, unusually so, the kind of girl who read the newspaper at breakfast and argued with her father about editorial positions until he pushed back his chair and called it a night. She won a scholarship to study at Victoria College in Toronto. She arrived with 2 trunks, a box of books, and a question she had been carrying since she was 9 years old, when her younger brother died of scarlet fever in a week. And the minister came to the house and said it was God's will, and something in her chest had quietly refused to accept that as an answer. She studied literature. She studied philosophy. She read the arguments of men who had decided God was a projection, and men who had decided he was a certainty, and men who had decided the question itself was poorly formed. None of them satisfied the thing inside her that kept asking. She graduated in 1913. Took a teaching position in Guelph and spent 3 years instructing the children of farmers in grammar and arithmetic and trying privately not to think too hard about what she was actually living for. Then the war came, and then it did not so much end as stop, in the exhausted way that very terrible things sometimes stop. And the world that came out the other side of 1918 was a different world, and Winifred was a different woman. Though she could not have told you exactly when the change had happened, or precisely what it was. She returned to Toronto. She took a position with a mission organization doing administrative work, correspondence, budgets, the practical arrangements by which people in comfortable offices send other people to uncomfortable places. She was good at it. She was fast, she was thorough, and she was bored in a way that had nothing to do with the work. One evening in the winter of 1921, a colleague invited her to a prayer meeting on Jarvis Street. Winifred went the way you go to things you do not expect to matter, punctually, with a coat and a polite expression. She sat near the back. She watched. What she watched was not what she had expected. There was no order of service. There was no organ. There were perhaps 40 people in the room, ranging from a dock worker she vaguely recognized from the mission soup line to a woman in a fur collar who looked as though she had taken a wrong turn from a society dinner. They were praying, not the kind of praying Winifred knew. The careful, measured kind, like a letter addressed to someone you respected but did not know well. This was something else. It was urgent. It was immediate. It was as though the people in that room were talking to someone who was actually present. She did not receive anything that night. She sat through the entire meeting with her coat still buttoned and her hands in her lap and felt mostly confused. But she came back the following week, and the week after that. This is the part of the story that requires patience. Hers and ours. It is easy to tell the part where the fire falls. It is harder to sit in the weeks before it, which are long and quiet and feel From the inside, mostly like failure. Winifred came to that prayer meeting for 11 weeks before anything shifted. 11 weeks of watching other people weep and sing and receive what she could not seem to reach. She was not performing. She was not doubting her way out of it. She was genuinely, stubbornly, quietly hungry. She wrote about it later with the kind of honesty that most of us reserve for private letters. I began to suspect that the barrier was not between me and an experience. It was between me and an honesty I had not yet been willing to attempt. In the 12th week, on a Thursday evening in February, something broke open in her. She could not have described it in theological language at the time. What she said to the woman sitting beside her afterward was simply, "It is real. I did not know it was this real." She left that meeting and walked home in a February that was still very cold, and the cold did not touch her at all. Within a month, Winifred had begun asking questions about missionary work in the Canadian North. Not the organized, denominationally funded kind. She knew those structures. She had worked inside them. She respected them and quietly suspected they were not what she was being called toward. She began writing letters to people who had been up in the James Bay Territory, the Treaty 9 communities, the places where roads did not go, and where the particular combination of colonial disruption, residential school trauma, and isolated geography had created conditions that the administrative world she worked in could describe accurately on paper and help almost not at all in practice. A man named Arthur Fenwick, who had spent 7 years in the North before his health forced him south, wrote back to her. He told her what she would find. He did not soften it. He told her about the tuberculosis rates, which were staggering, about the communities that had lost most of their elders within living memory and were now navigating a transition no one had asked them to make between a world that had worked for 10,000 years and a world that had arrived in the form of missionaries and government agents and residential school recruiters. He told her about the drinking, about the violence that followed from it, about the children. Then he wrote, "If you are asking whether you should go, you already know the answer. You are simply afraid of what it will cost you." She was 29 years old. She had been genuinely filled with the Spirit for less than 2 months. She had never been north of Huntsville. She went anyway. She arrived at the Moose Factory mission post in October 1922. The trip had taken 11 days from Toronto, the last portion of it by canoe, in rain, with a guide named Calvin, who spoke minimal English and communicated his opinion of the whole enterprise primarily through expression. The mission post was a 2-room building that had been serving as an intermittent medical clinic, a schoolroom, and a storage facility for supplies that arrived irregularly and were always insufficient. The community had seen missionaries before. They had seen missionaries who came with good intentions and left when the winters proved harder than anticipated. They had seen missionaries who stayed, but spent the whole time trying to replace what the people already had, rather than standing beside them in it. They had seen missionaries who genuinely loved the people, and were nonetheless, almost inevitably, entangled in systems that did harm while meaning to do good. Winifred knew this. She had read enough to know this. She knew it the way you know something in your head before you have lived inside it. She spent the first 6 months doing very little preaching. She learned. She made mistakes that would have been avoided by more experience, and she did not pretend otherwise. There was a woman in the community. She was in her 70s, and she was known by everyone, and her name in Cree meant something to do with water and with persistence, who watched Winifred for most of those 6 months without saying much directly to her. Then one day she sat down beside Winifred while Winifred was struggling to repair a piece of equipment she did not understand, and she said, in English that was perfectly precise, "You are the first one who has not told us what we are missing." That sentence opened more doors than anything Winifred would have been able to say. She met Walter Buxton the following summer. He was a carpenter from Sudbury who had come up to help build a proper meeting hall. He was a man of deep and uncomplicated faith, the kind that does not produce interesting theology, but produces extraordinary steadiness. He was also funny, which Winifred had not been expecting and found almost immediately disarming. They were married at the end of 1924, in the meeting hall he had helped build, in a ceremony attended by most of the village, and conducted partly in English and partly in Cree. For 4 years they worked together. Walter built things. Winifred taught and visited and prayed and preached and ran the practical machinery of the mission. They were not running a flashy operation. There were no dramatic reports sent back to Toronto about mass conversions. There was quiet work, consistent presence, and a growing trust that was, Winifred knew, harder to build and easier to destroy than any structure Walter had ever put up. The meetings were small. They were real. People came not because they were expected to, but because something was there when they arrived. Winifred could not manufacture it and knew better than to try. She prayed before every meeting with the kind of desperation that success can sometimes cause you to forget, and that she had kept, deliberately, from the beginning. Then Walter died. February 1928. Heart failure, sudden, no warning, on a morning when he had gone out to check on a section of roof. He was 36 years old. Winifred found him in the snow. She did not go back to Toronto. She thought about it. There was a period of roughly 3 weeks where she sat in the mission house, and the question of whether to stay was genuinely open. People in Toronto wrote to her. People at the mission board wrote to her, kindly, suggesting it would be understandable to return. The assumption behind most of the letters was that the North had been a project that Walter's death had now concluded. She did not understand that assumption. She had not come because of Walter. She had come because she had been called. Walter's death had not revoked the call. It had made it more expensive. Those were not the same thing. She stayed. The years from 1928 to 1932 were the years that cost the most. The mission board's funding became irregular, then infrequent, then essentially stopped. Not because anyone decided against her formally, but because without a married couple to point to, without the easier narrative of devoted husband and wife missionaries in the wilderness, the organization found it harder to raise support for a single woman in her 30s, with unconventional methods, and a refusal to produce the kind of conversion statistics that made good newsletter content. She wrote letters explaining what was happening in the community. They were not easily summarized in the format the newsletters required. She began in this period to pray differently. Not from strategic necessity, but from actual depletion. She had nothing left to bring except herself. In those early morning hours, in the darkness before anyone else was awake, she found something she had not expected to find through subtraction. She found an intercession that was not about programs or outcomes, or even about the specific people she was praying for. It was more fundamental than that. It was simply holding the community before God with the entirety of what she had, and waiting. She wrote in her journal, "I have stopped asking for results. I have started asking for presence. I believe they are related. I believe the second produces the first, in a way that the first pursued alone never could." She was not the first person to discover this. She was not claiming to be. But she had to discover it herself, on the floor of a cold building in northern Ontario, before she understood what Durham and Seymour, and all those other names in the history of revival, had actually been doing in their prayer rooms at 2 in the morning. They were not generating something. They were removing everything that blocked what was already there. That is when things began to change. It was not a single moment. It was more like the way a river changes in spring. Not a switch thrown, but a gradual, unstoppable movement of weight. The meetings grew. Not because Winifred promoted them. People came from other communities, traveling in conditions that should have prevented it, because something was moving, and they could sense it the way you can sometimes sense rain before there is any visible sign of cloud. A man arrived from a community 3 days' travel north who had heard, through the particular transmission system that operates in isolated places entirely through word of mouth, that something was happening at the Moose Factory meeting. He was a respected man, a leader in his community, and he was dying of tuberculosis. He came because he had run out of other options, which is, Winifred knew, often exactly when people are willing to receive what they would not have received in other circumstances. He attended 3 meetings. On the 3rd evening, during a time of prayer that had become very quiet, the kind of quiet that is different from silence, because something is in it, He stood up and said he felt heat moving through his chest. He asked Winifred what that meant. She told him she thought it meant God was present and working. She prayed with him. She did not touch him. She did not shout. She simply held the space. He returned to his community. 3 months later, he sent word that his doctors had found no trace of the disease. Word of this traveled faster than any newsletter Winifred had ever written. By 1933, people were coming to the mission from communities spread across a territory the size of several European nations. Ministers arrived from further south, curious and in some cases frankly skeptical, because the reports were the kind that make careful people uncomfortable. Winifred did not defend herself to them. She showed them what was happening and let them form their own conclusions. Most of them came as skeptics and left as witnesses. A woman named Frances Garland came in 1933. She was a minister's wife from Sault Ste. Marie, who had been ill with rheumatoid arthritis for 7 years, who could not hold a pen without pain, who arrived at the meeting on a cold night in November, looking like someone who had come to observe and found herself instead on her knees, and who walked out 3 hours later and wrote a 20-page account that was circulated in Pentecostal communities across Ontario and into Quebec and eventually to churches in Western Canada and across the border. That account is why we know as much as we do about what happened in those years, because Winifred kept no systematic record herself. She was not interested in documentation. She was interested in the thing itself. There were inevitably critics. There were people who said the healings were psychosomatic, which Winifred did not bother arguing against, because she was not certain it mattered where the healing came from, as long as people were healed. There were people within her own tradition who said she had no proper ordination, no formal authority, no right to be doing what she was doing, which was a fair enough observation about the structures, and beside the point about the outcomes. There were people who said a woman alone in the wilderness was a liability and a scandal, which was the kind of objection that Winifred had stopped spending energy on sometime around 1929. She did not retaliate. She did not write polemical letters. She kept opening the door in the morning. The coughing that had begun in 1931 was tuberculosis. She had known for a year before she told anyone. When she finally went south to confirm the diagnosis, in the spring of 1933, her doctor told her what he thought was the appropriate course of action, which was rest and a sanatorium and a complete cessation of the work she was doing. She returned north in 3 weeks. This is not presented here as wisdom. It may have been stubbornness. The line between the two is not always where we expect it to be. What is clear is that she understood the choice she was making and made it anyway, with full information and without drama. She wrote to her sister in Barrie, "I know what they told me. I also know what I am being asked to do. I think these two things will resolve themselves one way or another. I am more interested in the days between now and then than in the resolution." The resolution came on an April evening in 1937. She was 45 years old. She had been working in the North for 15 years. The community gathered. They sang. A man who had been at the meeting in 1932, the one whose spine had straightened, sat in the front row and held her hand. She died with the sound of prayer around her, in the building that Walter had built, in the village that had become the most real home she had ever inhabited. She had not seen most of what her work produced. She could not have seen it. She died before the communities she had prayed over sent their own missionaries outward. Before the Cree-speaking evangelists who had come through her meeting room carried what they had received into territories she had never reached. She died before the revival network that traced its roots, indirectly but genuinely, back to that Northern Ontario mission touched communities across 4 provinces. She died before the generation of Indigenous Christian leaders who cited her influence. Cited it without knowing her name in most cases, because she had passed through their communities' histories as a presence rather than a documented institution. Went on to do work of their own. She never saw the harvest, but the seed was already in the ground, in the frozen soil of a territory that most of Canada had decided was beyond reach, in the hands of people she had simply refused to stop showing up for. She left no denomination. She left no organization. She left, in the community's keeping, a journal that was not published in her lifetime, and was not discovered by anyone outside the community for decades. When it was finally read carefully, what people found in it was not a theology of power or a manual for revival. What they found was the record of a woman who had learned, by subtraction, what is left when everything else is removed. What is left is enough, more than enough. It turns out to be everything. The question pressing toward you now is not whether Winifred Buxton was extraordinary. She was, in most of the ways that matter, ordinary, educated but not exceptional, faithful but not without doubt, present but not without exhaustion. The question is what you have been calling the barrier between you and what you are actually hungry for. She called it honesty. She sat in that prayer meeting for 11 weeks before she was willing to be completely honest. Not honest about doctrine, not honest about attendance, honest about the hollow place that activity cannot fill, the place you have been managing, decorating, occasionally forgetting about, and returning to find still there. She got on a canoe into the Canadian Shield. She opened the door at 3 a.m. She stayed when the reasons to leave were legitimate, and the reasons to stay were harder to explain. The communities she served will tell you she changed everything. She would tell you she mostly just refused to leave. Both of those things are true, and they are not separate things. The refusal to leave, sustained long enough by someone who has nothing left to sustain it except the thing she was called to. That is not stubbornness. That is a kind of fire. And fire, as it turns out, does not require a platform. It does not require a denomination's endorsement, or a mission board's newsletter, or a husband still alive to make the story legible to people in comfortable offices. It requires a door that someone keeps opening, whatever door you have been standing in front of. And you know which one it is. The same question that settled on Winifred Grace Buxton on a February night in Toronto in 1921 is the question waiting for you now. Not whether you believe it is real. You already know it is real. The question is whether you are willing to be that honest about it.